being sent around. And we are in the process of writing a few more. And this conversation between the two of us and our colleagues, started some months ago and certainly has continued with force after the actual ruling came down. But a ruling was leaked in the spring and made final in late June that has the impact of saying that there is not a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. That does not make abortion illegal, but that allows individual states to do what they will with abortion, including making it illegal. So we have our eyes on different states, as a lot of states are quickly changing their laws, and those laws are being tested. Some have some interesting legal features, like enabling citizens to effectively make a citizen's arrest of anyone who aids and abets someone in getting an abortion, looking at Texas specifically there, though other states are playing with that concept. So someone who drives someone else out of state to procure an abortion or pays for an abortion could potentially be liable under a law like that. So we're looking at a framework in the United States where there is unequal access to reproductive rights. There will be states where there is access. There will be states where there is not. And a lot of people who need to get to those states where they can safely procure abortion services with potential liability for those who help them to get there. The right to abortion in the United States under Roe v. Wade was under reasoning dependent on an implied right to privacy in the Constitution. There have been a number of other legal decisions also based on that right. And the word privacy and abortion are not in the Constitution. A concurring opinion was written by Justice Thomas that said, hey, we should expand this train of thought and we should take another look at those decisions that the court previously made, saying the right to privacy allows gay marriage and allows contraception without interference from the state. So there are other rights that are potentially under fire here. And Ed, please fill in any gaps you think I left there, but I would just add the conversation really started from a place of despair, right? We're not reproductive rights lawyers. What can we do? But for reproductive rights, I wouldn't have my personal and professional success. Like this really hits home for all of us. And we went from a place of there's nothing we can do, this is awful, other than political donations, to wait a second, we are all lucky enough to be leaders in a field that employs a lot of people, and people have reproductive needs. So what do we do about that? What can venture-backed companies do, and what are the risks? And that's really what we've been exploring, and we want to talk more about, and really want it to be a conversation. This is not exhaustive, we have answers. It's let's come together as a community and come up with ideas and assess the impact of those ideas, the risks and the benefits. And what did I miss that I should have covered?
I thought that was great.
And to make this clear, let's talk about the reproductive rights to begin with. I think I would love to go into what you already mentioned. This is likely not the end of these decisions that the Supreme Court has taken. But let's talk about this question that's in front of us right now. I really liked, I'm obviously not a lawyer. I'm very much a qualitative academic who happens to know a little bit about VC, but I really liked your approach to actually, from a legal perspective, there's a couple of things we can do. Can you tell us a little bit about what options are for investors in particular, and then also for the companies in order to act right now / going forward, given the frameworks that have now already changed / are in the process of changing?
Yeah, so when I think about investors in these companies, you have board seats often. And if you don't have a board seat, you still have a direct line to company management. And so that's a platform you can use to raise the question of what are we doing for our own employees' reproductive rights? And as Ed always frames it, what are we doing to expand or at least be neutral on access to reproductive rights and health equity versus what are we doing to make it worse? one policy that we're seeing companies, some companies have adopted, others are considering adopting, is saying we'll pay for travel for our employees in states that don't provide access to states that do, right? And what does that mean? Does that also mean you're also providing for their dependents? If there is a defense cost, for example, your employee has a child who is on the health plan in a state that does not permit abortion, and you as the employee help that child to travel and you get sued. Are you also covering defense costs? So, what could those policies be? And then, we're really looking at the assessment of, is that something all the investors will back, right? Should investors, and these are things we're still thinking about, should you be talking to your LPs about alignment of values? When you're bringing additional directors onto a board, independence, is that a question you want to be asking? Where do they stand on reproductive rights? What position should the company be taking? So it's really starting that conversation at a board level and with everyone else in that sphere of influence about what kind of company do we want to be here? And this is hitting really all the companies we work with in a remote work environment. We're seeing people really spread across the United States and certainly dependents spread across the states as well.
Yeah, perhaps, Ilana, from a GP perspective, have you got ideas of what you would like to do, what you're already planning on doing? Have you spoken to other GPs who are in similar positions and are having thoughts about this?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's good to see everybody. So, I think first and foremost, from a GP perspective, of course, is how can we support our portfolio companies? And I think there's a couple of ways of doing that. One is, as folks are trying to develop these policies around what benefits they might change to provide for their employees, like there's a lot of new terrain, right? There's some employers who are really worried that they could be held criminally liable if they're viewed as helping their employees break the law. There's lots of questions, for folks who are saying, yes, we will pay for your travel for reproductive health care. Is the company collecting data and medical records on who asks for travel assistance for an abortion? What if it's a coworker's teenage dependent? There's a lot of questions that our portfolio companies and companies sort of a click harder than ours are contemplating. And so one thing that's been great is we've been seeing both the CEOs themselves, their HR lead, GPs kind of sharing and open sourcing resources as folks are trying to develop policies and figure out what fits, and also finding, working with them around policies. A number of companies have been talking about, to the extent that we have employees that might want to relocate based on this new policy climate, how do we support those employees in doing that? So some of it is just being a thought partner and helping companies think through that, and think through how to do that, on the runway that they have and in a way that's aligned with their values, and that is legally compliant. And so we've been thinking through all of that. I think another piece of this too is sort of what are different ways for the business community overall, including investors, but not entirely, to be sort of thinking through how we raise our voice in this moment, because women's bodily autonomy is obviously, it's a moral issue, and also it's an economic issue. We can draw a very direct line to the sort of economic participation of women and its impact on the broader economy of women being able to make these choices. And so, whether it's, I've had friends at venture funds who are in some of these states, or at least have staff in some of these states, raising their voices, some more quietly than others. Sometimes it's a LinkedIn post, sometimes it's not bad. Frankly, I would like to see a lot more of it. And just to be candid too, I do think I would have liked to have seen the response from the venture world be a bit louder and stronger. I would have liked to have seen more men raising their voice. Sometimes Ed was a bit standing alone amongst men who were in this conversation, because I think sometimes it is left, for women to stand up on this a little bit. But I do think it's also worth noting, because I know that there's both GPs and LPs on this call. This is also a little bit of the balance of who I don't know who most of the LPs are in my friends' funds. I'm very proud to have LPs that I think are very aligned with our values and would sort of support us expressing our opinions on these topics, would support us, have of course been supporting us in making investments in women's health, for quite some time. But I do think there's been this delicate dance that I certainly know a lot of GPs who wanted to, stand up and be more vocal, but felt that either their current set of LPs might not be pleased or believed it would hurt them in subsequent fundraising, especially as sort of early, diverse, emerging managers, which is sort of another ingredient in this.
And being vocal is one thing, Ilana, right? But then actually what Meredith just laid out, paying for, say, your own employee in a fund to get an abortion, or paying or supporting a portfolio company paying with your money for that is a totally another one, right? How is that conflict then going to pan out with your LP, for instance?
100%, and clearly, given that most venture funds are rather slender teams, like the sort of economic impact, it's obviously going to hit the direct companies much more, and the numbers are, you've seen some folks, sort of saying we'll reimburse, is that $2,000 a year? Netflix is offering $10,000 lifetime allowance. Everyone is kind of trying to also figure out like what is the right number, and also what does it cover. And I'll also note too, just one other note, and then I'll. As someone who looks quite a bit at reproductive health and innovations in fertility, given our thesis, we have some investments around AI and machine learning to improve outcomes in fertility treatments. Already a lot of people who are both IVF patients as well as investors and builders in those spaces are also really taking this decision to note, in part because there's going to be a lot of states where it feels to people like there's a real lack of clarity on what is going to happen with embryos and sort of policy around IVF. And actually, my cousin is a reproductive nurse in Chicago, a reproductive health nurse, and she said that within 72 hours of the decision, they were basically getting freezer units of embryos being sent from states that had trigger bans. And to clarify, a trigger ban, the trigger ban laws, which had been passed in more than a dozen states in the US, they've basically been passed years before Roe v. Wade fell via Dobbs, and they were bans on abortion that were set to go into effect at whatever point, the trigger, in this case, Dobbs, happened. But anyway, so, just the fact that all these embryos are being shipped overnight so soon after the decision, I think is just suggesting an enormous uncertainty. And obviously it is difficult for true cutting edge innovation to thrive in an environment with a lot of policy uncertainty. Already a lot of this innovation is happening in companies headquartered in states like California and New York that will presumably be safe states for IVF, for abortion care, and all these other sorts of things. But I do think we're going to see even more of a geographic divide in where healthcare innovators might want to start their businesses if they want to avoid a lot of scrutiny and uncertainty.
Ed, with your other hat with a T on, LP action, what could you consider doing? What kind of statements have you already made to your GP base? What have you seen other LPs do? And where do you think is a frontier? Like what is this? What is a responsibility, and where do you kind of stop?
Yeah. So first, I do want to thank Ilana for saying that. I do think that men should be raising their voices. I also feel like I should be vocal about this, but that the voices that should be centered are those of people who are pregnant or can become pregnant, which obviously is more than just women. And I also want to make sure that when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about reproductive rights pertaining to abortion. We're talking about a D&C after miscarriage. We're talking about access to cancer screening. We're talking about access to treatment for people with lupus, with irritable bowel syndrome, with numerous other issues that use drugs, use medications that overlap with abortive agents. And so the desire of the I'll say the Republican Party, and I want to come back to that for a minute because I think this is a really important concept. The desire of the Republican Party to legislate what medications people who are pregnant or can become pregnant take and to legislate the decisions a doctor has to make, such as whether and when something is life-threatening to the pregnant person enough for the doctor to take action. These are such broadly encompassing restrictions that we are not talking about just limiting abortion. Let me be clear, if we were talking about just limiting abortion, I would still be very vocal. And I think that we should be very vocal, and that in particular, heterosexual, cisgendered white men should be very vocal, because we're the ones who are pushing this agenda. And on the issue of contraception, there was a concurrence written by Judge Clarence Thomas. And I say judge because that's what the Constitution calls them. I know they call themselves justices, but that's been an issue for me lately. Judge Clarence Thomas talked about, in his concurrence, limiting access to contraception because the Griswold case from about 60 years ago that ensures the right to access to contraception is something that he thinks was incorrectly decided at the time and ever since. And initially, when the conversations unfolded, people said, well, they're not going to go there. That's outlandish. And within a couple of weeks, 96% of elected Republicans in Congress voted against enshrining the right of access to contraception in federal law. And so it is a very short hop and a skip to you can't get condoms because the cashier at Walmart doesn't feel comfortable, doesn't feel that it's consistent with their own religious beliefs to give you condoms, and that's okay under the new edict. So let's go back to what you can do. And Meredith said earlier that, what can you do to expand access to reproductive rights and equitable access to healthcare, or at least be neutral. And I just want to clarify, I never talked about at least be neutral. I talked about protect and expand, different than neutral, because I do believe that we're under fire at this point. So LPs can put in their side letters that the fund will not make investments into companies that are looking to restrict or impair the access to equitable health care of their team members or of the public, that the fund will not invest in companies that are looking to restrict the reproductive rights and impair the reproductive health of their team members and the dependents of those team members. And you're right that these funds are somewhat thinly staffed for the most part, and therefore the impact is going to be much smaller. And if you work at a venture fund, there's a great argument that mostly these are people with some financial privileges. And it's very clear, and the medical community has commented widely on this, that these laws are going to be most impactful on folks who are on the lower end of the economic spectrum and also on underrepresented communities. So making sure that we are fanning these protections out more broadly, like the portfolio companies, is important. So for instance, a forward-thinking venture investor could say in their term sheet, when we designate board members or when we vote for board members, we will prioritize and make it imperative or use a litmus test that the board member must be willing to, as part of their fiduciary obligations, protect and expand the reproductive rights and access to equitable health care for the company. Now, the next question is, are we seeing this? And the answer is no. And we need to normalize these conversations, and we need to make it part of the discussion. We are definitely seeing founders and funders who want to know what they can do and who want to put in place policies, and who are willing, even as the market is shrinking, who are willing to spend money or at least agree to spend money. And we lay a bunch of these out in in that article and also in the TechCrunch article where you and I were quoted together on this issue.
What is if say I'm a portfolio company of Ilana's and I fund one of my employees to cross the state border and get an abortion, what could happen? And what can Ilana possibly do? And what could you as an LP in Ilana, or what could an LP of Ilana's do? To speak very concretely about this.
You're pointing that at me?
At you three, before I have a question for Dama, but you three, what ideas do you have about
Ed, as someone who merely plays lawyer on TV, as a former policy person, but I'm definitely not, I will give that one to you first.
I'll take it first, and I think the answer is we're waiting to see on enforcement a bit, right? So a lot of this is hypothetical, but we have seen Texas write the Sidley letter to a law firm that said that they were going to pay for this, saying if you do this, we're coming after you with civil and criminal penalties. And so that's the risk to the company, right? And we're in active conversations with D&O insurance companies trying to understand what they will and won't cover. Because we haven't seen it done yet, to my knowledge. We've seen it threatened, but certainly we're concerned with company liability and with director liability. We're also working with our friends on our litigation side on formulating defenses there. I think there is a strong argument that it is within the fiduciary duties of a board to provide this kind of access. There's a tension, right? It's against the law. But supporting employees, building a diverse pool of talent is very consistent with making sure that your employees have access to reproductive care. So, it's not a firm, bright line answer at this point. It's a, we're hypothesizing, and it's a wait and see, unfortunately.
And within the last couple of hours, a Michigan court just decided that you can prosecute under the 1931 law that was essentially suspended by Roe. And the wonderful Attorney General, Dana Nessel in Michigan, has said that she and the members of her team, won't, but others will prosecute under that law. It is a dark day in Michigan. This happened literally within the last 2 hours. And I think that understanding, so in every deal, even in the form SAFE that Y Combinator has on its website, there are reps and warranties that say the company complies with law. Understanding, being proactive and carving out, except to the extent that doing so impairs the reproductive rights of your team, for instance. Like those are some things that you can do. Also understanding how you're going to help and support a company where there is an investigation or there is a subpoena looking for those records relating to what you have done. I think those are going to be important ways, but I do think that we actually have to make sure that when people say, let's compartmentalize these conversations, let's not have a conversation about abortion in a business meeting. We have to say no, like this is part of the conversation. People for whom these things are less personal, less relevant, have controlled the conversation for too long. Let's make it part of the public dialogue. And it doesn't matter that you're uncomfortable about it or that it causes a rift, because by continuing to sweep it under the rug, we're going to continue to exacerbate the problem. And if you care about the S and the G, it seems like it's important to discuss this stuff.
There was a really good question in the Q&A raised that I think ties in here about the potential impact of Dobbs on gender diversity and the pay gap. And to my mind, it's bad for gender diversity and the pay gap, right? I think if you want to have senior people in your organization who are or could become pregnant, right? That means that they need to at some point, well, not for everyone. I could speak to myself. The ability to put off marriage and after that to put off having children and to have the number of children I wanted has been vital in my ability to become a senior lawyer at my law firm. If I was not able to control that, I would not have this job or this level of success. And I think it would be very hard for anyone who could not control when they were going to bear children to rise through the ranks where they're really in leadership positions at companies or in companies for very long at all. This pushes women out of the workforce and pushes anyone who could be pregnant out of the workforce. And so I think it's very important. And that's really the fiduciary argument is we're going to lose talent if we don't make sure that we can let talent into our organization and keep talent here by letting our talent choose when they're ready to have a family.
And yeah, maybe just one thing I'll note. So two things. I totally agree with Meredith. I think like a talent story is always really powerful. And I also think it obviously happens to be incredibly accurate. And you know, even though we're in a economic slowdown impending, we can all discuss what we actually think is we can have a macroeconomic conversation at a different time. But you know, I still think, you know, certainly within tech, there's still certainly a war for senior technical talent for sure, and ensuring that you're creating an environment that is inclusive where your top talent wants to be, I think really matters. One other note, you know, to this point about the legal uncertainty, I've already been starting to see it drip into diligence processes on the VC side. So for instance, you know, there's a company called Hey Jane that does D2C provision of medication abortions, fabulous founder. And, you know, I remember getting calls from a bunch of different VCs. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I used to be a DC policy person, but I'm not a lawyer. I think sometimes people think I am, but I got a bunch of phone calls from other GPs basically saying, we're trying to diligence this deal and don't know how to diligence the legal risk. And, you know, this is a great company. I think it should exist. Has pretty powerful like financial fundamentals here. And then there's this big black box. And there's a number of companies, whether directly provisioning abortion-related care, but also in a number of just sort of women's health-related fields that people believe might be impacted here. You know, it's not a good thing for founders, obviously, when there's, you know, a bunch of people trying to diligence your company who feel like there are things they can't get to that they can't bottom out as part of their investment process. You know, and obviously the best that we could be doing, which, you know, at this point is we keep you know, a list of lawyers who are as versed as possible in you know, women's health and telemedicine and reproductive health, both in the nonprofit and for-profit spaces that we keep on offer to fellow investors, friends, founders. But you know, I do think the longer we have all of these kind of gray spaces and all the uncertainty that creates, you know, I'm already seeing some of the tricky areas it creates for those trying to build in this space and raise in this environment.
Dharma, you're the GP here in Europe. What have you been hearing in conversations, A, with founders, B, with other GPs, C, with LPs when it comes to this? Obviously, as soon as you have a portfolio company in the US, as soon as an LP you have a GP in the US, you are potentially impacted by this. What are your initial thoughts on this?
So I've heard more from founders than I've heard from other VCs or other LPs, predominantly because we have a large European base as well, and co-investors usually are equally European based. But we've had instances now where two portfolio founders, companies have just done a Delaware flip in the last 6 months, or where some of the employees are now moving to the US as well for a wider US expansion plan as well. And that certainly has had an impact on the companies as well. And portfolio founders as such are just asking themselves what, if at all, actually equates and falls under access to reproductive care, especially with sort of different legal territories in mind, but also what sort of implications it might have on people's mental well-being. So this is my other hat on outside of the venture world. I'm a trustee for a domestic abuse charity as well, and there's loads and loads of talk about actually considering data privacy as a reproductive rights issue as well. And that's, as someone alluded to earlier, particularly looking into what sort of data is accessible or can be requested on employees, whether it's at a fund or at a portfolio company, around particular access to healthcare if provisions exist where travel, accommodation, or others are being offered as an extension now. But also in terms of actually thinking about some of the mental well-being or the mental well-being of respective employees, individuals who are seeking abortion services as well. So there's a lot in the sort of tech world around really horrible tactics around like geofencing, for example, which then is triggering particular physical spaces, but in a digital manner to actually just spam people with anti-abortion content, which can be quite triggering for a lot of people who are seeking services as well. So there's sort of different elements that we're seeing evolve as well, but particularly because we are focused on tech for good as such as well, we see a lot more on the tech side evolve as well, which actually sort of brings to mind that we also need to not just think about the physical consequences of this, but also the mental well-being and mental health of staff members as well, or portfolio founders as such.
Yeah, thank you for these thoughts, Dama. We've already alluded to this a little bit. Perhaps we can go back to, I think either Meredith or Ed spoke about Meredith. It was actually that this is not just about reproductive rights. Can you repeat again what was officially and directly mentioned in the add-on from the judge, where we could be going next, and how that would look like, and what the possible problems are with these next steps? And
yeah, so as Ed alluded to, in the Dobbs decision itself, there are a number of non-abortion services that are really being pressured and potentially problematic in a lot of states right now, including post-miscarriage D&C, which is quite common. Certain forms of birth control, like IUDs, are now questionable in a number of states. Cancer screenings and a number of medications that people may take for other medical needs that may become less available now because they are also used in the provision of abortion services. So that's right now. The two main categories looking at going forward based on the Thomas concurrence are gay marriage and contraception. It's been interesting to watch the House of Representatives and the Republicans in the House of Representatives, because the Democrats did bring up bills to enshrine in law protections for those two areas. And it looks like there may be enough Republican support to enshrine gay marriage as a right. More Republicans did vote for that than were expected because the Republican parties did not whip votes on it. And we'll see what happens in the Senate. And the opposite on contraception. There was not GOP support to protect contraception. So, I see IUDs already under fire, but that could become more broad-based. I am pessimistically guessing, because it does feel like a war on women, that condoms could remain available longer than things like medical birth control, I think, will be under fire, but condoms could be as well. So that's something to keep an eye on if that were to be brought before the Supreme Court. I don't know that I haven't looked if there are still state laws on the books that could come back into force that would ban contraception in certain states. So that's an area to look at.
From an outside perspective, outside meaning from a European perspective, it's sometimes hard to understand what now happens on states versus what happens on the federal level. So as we've discussed so far, it's basically now in the hands of the state X or Y to make something legal or illegal, right? i.e., what we're going to see is that California and New York are going to be going on as before, while lots of states in the middle / in the south are going to likely shift / have already shifted, as Ilana, you've explained. What could the federal level do? And you already mentioned two things here. given that, theoretically speaking, again, from the outside, we have a democratic, we have Democrats in power, right? And we have a Democratic president.
Right. Well, the midterms are coming. And so we're looking to see if that's going to change. Right now, we don't have a filibuster proof majority in the Senate. So it makes the Democratic majority getting anything done difficult without enough GOP support. What the Supreme Court has said is the Supreme Court cannot decide that this is a constitutional right. You could, hypothetically, anything subject to challenge, but the Senate and House could come together and say, well, we're going to create a law that says everyone has access to abortion. Could that be questioned on federalism grounds? I'm sure the Republicans would try. I don't see that passing right now. What I'm more concerned about is the possibility that in the midterm elections, Republicans take power and try to pass the opposite law, which would ban or further limit abortion nationwide. And we've been looking at conversations, and it seems like there's some divisions in that party as to whether or not that's something they would want to pursue.
One question before I want to very strongly open up to any Q&A from the audience. Please feel free to both use the Q&A as well as the chat functionality, everyone else here. Where is this coming from? It seems absolutely insane, again, from a European perspective, to move in that direction. Taking rights away from, as we've just discussed, right? Anyone who can have a baby, but going forward, possibly very different groups, right? Gay rights being one of those, gay people being one of those groups affected. Is that a full-on ideological takeover that has been prepared by people like Trump with the Supreme Court replacements? Perhaps we can go for a minute. I don't want to take us too far in that direction into the history of where this, in a sense, this decision obviously also didn't came out of nowhere, but what is the kind of more fundamental issues that we're seeing come up here?
One minor note, it's interesting because I think for friends who spent a little less time in the reproductive health movement, I think there was a feeling that sort of smacked them in the face, like where is this coming from? And of course, like this was a 50-year strategy. It was actually a longer strategy, but I think one of the things on the right in the US is, they have long, deeply invested in like year over year in infrastructure, whether it was taking on these state cases after Roe had passed, sort of to dismantle, to attempt to sort of chip away, slowly saying, well, maybe you can't have an abortion at this many weeks or under these conditions, and sort of chipping away. So a lot of things, it sort of looked like to many on the outside, right, that the movement was dormant, or that they were losing for 45 years, and they were until they were winning. And I do think, the sort of institution building, and even the fact that, essentially all of the new justices who were added to the Supreme Court, there's a set of legal organizations that have been funded very strongly in the US by the right over decades to sort of produce the next generation of conservative jurists, and their sort of approval has become more and more of a litmus test. I think, the sort of elegance, and I say this, obviously as someone who does not necessarily agree with the direction this went, like the elegance of building this very long-term infrastructure was happening quietly and often at the local and state level for decades. And I think, the history of the US is in many ways like a history of this ongoing tension between moving backwards and moving forwards, and sort of progressive policies and sort of much more reactive, retrograde policies. And we've seen this kind of time and again amongst a lot of the sort of longer term movement-based change that we've seen in the US. I also have a variety of opinions I will leave to another date about some of the things that I think are potentially challenging about how we structured some of our democratic institutions that I think have made it easier for right-leaning voices to have more and more control, both legislatively and in the judiciary. But that might require a stiff drink and a longer conversation.
I invite anyone else to come in, and again, everyone else to ask questions before we can also close in the next 5 minutes if we wanted to.
Could I maybe, while people are, if it's okay, if people are we're waiting to see what questions come in, I just wanted to add one other thing, a sort of public health issue that I have become interested / concerned about in the wake of this decision, which is Americans, obviously, we have quite the fragmented healthcare system. 50% of Americans get their healthcare through their employer via employer-sponsored healthcare plans. And in many cases, those plans might still be insufficient with very high deductibles. But the point being that in the US, we already have a long history of care avoidance. So where people are avoiding either basic or specialty medical care that they need. Previously, in the last 12 months, more than half of Americans say they've avoided care because of the high cost of care. And now I think we're going to have, and we know that there's long-term downstream impacts on Americans' health, and that cost is borne by our healthcare system over the years. But for instance, if you go to the dentist and you have to get x-rays, what's the first question they ask you? Are you pregnant? Before they put that big metal vest on you and take your x-rays, right? That's just one example, but the point is there's going to be a lot of basic care that it may be the case that women of reproductive age in states where there are a lot of regulations around what they can and can't be doing with their bodies might be having now beyond cost, even another reason to be avoiding some basic care that they need regularly because their pregnancy or non-pregnancy status could come up and they might feel very vulnerable about it being recorded. So, point being, I think, unfortunately, there are some of the public health effects that we obviously have not yet started to see, but that I think in some ways go beyond, reproductive health per se, but have sort of extensions into other part of the general healthcare system.
Ed, Meredith, Dama, perhaps comments from you. Otherwise, we let Evie here ask a question. You're free to jump in.
So while we're waiting for the question, and I'd love to hear from Dama as well. I wanted to mention that we're having a version of this conversation next week at our Venture Crush event with my co-founder from First Close Partners, Regina Benjamin, who was the Surgeon General under President Obama and is a MacArthur genius, and Professor Jean Mandelblatt, who's an MD and teaches at Georgetown Medical and was in the 80s responsible for getting pap smears covered by insurance. It's the first time a diagnostic was covered and has been instrumental in getting breast exam protocols aligned, and Maria Velasaris, who raised a women's health fund as well called Steel Sky. So if folks want to join us for that, it looks like there is now a question or two, so maybe we can jump to that.
I think Evie actually raised her hand by accident, but we have another question here. What happens with Medicare coverage for abortion in those limited circumstances that are covered at all in states that ban abortion?
Are folks waiting for one of the lawyers to jump in? Meredith, you want to take it? You want me to?
Well, it's not going to cover you where it's not legal to get an abortion. Could it potentially cover it out of state? Yeah, maybe. I think we're waiting to see on that.
I think there will also be arguments about what constitutes an abortion. And we are going to see challenges relating to things that are a medical abortion and when the moment of conception and viability are. So for instance, if your medical procedure might be miscoded, you're going to see people use claims of insurance fraud because you miscoded to protect someone. We're going to see all sorts of legal challenges, like there's a Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 at the federal level. There are anti-discrimination laws pertaining to pregnancy at the state level. New York and California have strong versions, which is obviously those are two of the states more relevant to folks in venture. And those will give people the grounds to say, I am not making disclosure of which of my employees may have traveled or their dependents may have traveled out of state, because that would be violative of HIPAA. It might be violative of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. And the creativity around these legal challenges is going to be interesting, unfortunately. But there's an overlay, and that overlay is that Mitch McConnell has boasted that he spent the last several years of the Obama administration blocking judges. He then left an insane amount of openings for Donald Trump, who set a record by appointing the greatest number of judges ranked unqualified by the American Bar Association, which is a nonpartisan organization. So we're going to be putting things into a randomizer to see what judge we get, and whether it's a Trump appointee who is, trying to enforce these retrograde laws that are part of a platform that frankly is a misogynistic platform.
Yeah, again, I think I would like to give everyone a chance to say a final comment before closing.
Happy to start off, because I don't feel like I don't have much to contribute to this discussion, because it's still sort of unfolding, and how in the European-based GPs and LPs will react to this. But one particular venture fund, which I think has done really great work in actually highlighting some of the responses and trying to bring more transparency around the provision of abortion care coverage in the private sector is a fund called RIA Ventures, if people are familiar. They have also built a really excellent database, which I've used a hashtag for whatever reason. That is hashtag what are your refer benefits, which is basically a database that was created to help employees, investors, and different organizations and stakeholders actually get more informed around what they can actually advocate for, especially with regards to employee rights as well, with examples of what different companies have done. So I've found this database quite helpful in order to pass on to some of the portfolio founders in terms of actually trying to untangle the issue of what can be done, or to even find some inspiration of how we can advocate for equitable reproductive rights. And I'll leave with that before I am being thrown out of this office. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming down. Do we, Ilana, Meredith, Ed, do you want to end with a comment as well? If not, that's totally fine as well.
I'll just say thanks. Obviously, thanks for having me. I think it's great knowing that there are folks outside of the US who are kind of watching and learning with us and trying to get involved. I don't think we have a lot of concrete answers right now, but certainly for GPs who are on this call, if you have portfolio companies in the US, just as a offer from me, I'm happy to the extent that I have them to share sort of resources on how people are designing team policies and their in their people function to support their workers in this time. So if that's relevant to you, feel free to reach out to me. And we continue to be extremely bullish about the opportunities in investing in women's health, and we hope you do too.
Yeah, I would end with I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. Happy to continue it. This is all really imperfect solutions. We're working on them. At the same time, it is deeply unfair to tell an employee that they need to disclose to their employer, even if the employer can shield it, to go and have to say, I need a miscarriage, I need a D&C, I need an IUD inserted. That can be deeply stigmatizing. So this is still problematic, even if we implement these solves. And I think there's power in personal stories. in leaders sharing how they have benefited from these services to ease the process, but it's difficult and deeply sad to me that all we're talking about is helping the tech community, and the unemployed in our country really will not have this access. So the more we can do to think on that and advocate for real change, the better.
So I just want to add, when you think about the boardrooms you've sat in as a VC, when you think about the boardrooms presiding over the companies you've worked at, and even the LPAC rooms or the investment committees of boards, think about how dominated by men those rooms are, how dominated by straight men, by affluent straight white men, and how removed from some of these decisions the majority of people who make the decisions in those boardrooms seem to be. That's a problem. And that's why this is such an important topic from an ESG perspective. The lack of empathy in the American judiciary right now has reached a really problematic apex. I hope that it is going to start to trend in the other direction, but I do not have confidence that it will. But part of that empathy and part of the lived experience, those things are really important for boardrooms. And if you are choosing an ESG agenda, and if you're choosing to pursue good governance, it seems that it would be completely misaligned to fail to consider how important it is to have people in those rooms who are making these decisions who have an understanding of how these issues personally impact the team, the families, so that you're prioritizing, if we're going to sell this company, does this buyer commit before we go exclusive in the letter of intent that they will protect and expand the reproductive rights and access to equitable healthcare of our team members? Those kinds of things seem very consistent with ESG, and I hope that we start to see them come to the fore in term sheets, LOIs, and discussions about who is fit to serve as a board member.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to speak for Venture ESG as an organization, and also for the largest majority of our community, that we believe that ESG is more complex than what some people would like it to be, including The Economist with last week's special that basically said ESG should just be E because we know how to measure that. Let's remove all the complexity. And if anything, this conversation has shown this is a phenomenally important topic. I said earlier, this is part of a human rights issue as much as it is a DI issue, which are two of the two building blocks of ESG, as we believe. So how can you possibly dismiss this? And yes, this is first and foremost an American conversation, but anyone who has any ties, and the venture community as well as the startup community is very, very interlinked, including on the firm level, to America is directly implemented in this conversation. So thank you so much, the three of you, including Dharma, for coming today. We'll continue pushing this conversation forward, and please do send everything, both people in the community as well as you here on the panel, that you're publishing / any advice you have, and we are very happy to distribute that among our community, both of the GPs and of the LPs, and hopefully we'll have another conversation with a little bit more clarity of what specifically we can do and what is an immediate win going forward. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and have as good a week as it could be. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Bye.